for joining us. Welcome to Strange Resonances, Poetry, Craft, and Technique for Speculative Writing. I'm your moderator, Sarah Davis. I am not a poet, I'm just a big poetry fan, so I am really excited to welcome you all here and learn from these talented and imaginative writers. Those of you who are tuning in, if you have questions for the panelists as we go along, if you could please put them in the chat in WebEx. I will be keeping an eye on the Discord as well, but it'll just be easier for me to tell when you have a question for me to direct to the chat. Right now, someone's asked us for the panelists to put their Twitter or Instagram contact information in the chat. So if you all on the panel could do that when you get a chance to do so. I would like to start by inviting each of you to tell us a little bit about yourselves, starting with Akua.
Greetings and good evening. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Onondaga, also known as the Seneca, keepers of the Western Door in the area currently called the Southern Finger Lakes region of New York State. And here it's a bit after 9 p.m. Thank you to Flights of Foundry for including me in this wonderful conversation. I'm a poet creator who also writes short fiction. I wrote my first speculative poems in the 6th grade, and I've been in print since 1974 with nearly 500 poems published in lots of places. My chapbook, Otherwares, Speculative Poetry, is a 2021 Elgin Award winner. And I've got a micro chapbook that you can all access at the Quarantine Public Library. The Quarantine Public Library lets you do one-page books. Please check that out. Someone's making a lot of scratchy noises. So anyway, I created Speculative Sundays, an online poetry reading series. I'm the editor of the record-breaking largest issue ever of Eye to the Telescope, also available to you free, so please check it out on the C. And the history-making, first ever BIPOC speculative poetry collection called Nambono, an anthology of speculative poetry by BIPOC creators. That was also in 2021. For this year, I won 10 grand from the New York State Council of the Arts to create Afrofuturist pastoral speculative poetry. Did I get it out? Yeah, I did.
Thank you.
And I'm in the process of editing 2 new anthologies, one on speculative cats and a speculative poetry anthology on trees.
Thank you so much. Also, I love trees, so I'm very excited to hear about that one. M. Shaw, do you prefer to go by Shaw, or what shall we call you?
People call me Sam or Samuel or M Shaw or just Shaw. That's
all right.
Pretty
Tell us
much
a little bit about
as long
yourself.
as I can figure out that you're talking about me. I am M. Shaw. I am also a fiction writer and poet. In the poetry department, I am the former organizer of the Denver Mercury Poetry Slam, which is one of the longest running slam nights in the world. I am also famously a wild card in terms of my actual work that turns up there. My poetry is currently most available via my chapbooks, A Race Between the Air and the Bullets, and Gross Anatomy. And I have a full-length collection, Embrace Failure, Embrace Death, that this is true of a number of things I've done lately. I can say that it's coming out somewhere within the next couple years. We're still deciding on the venue. But also, in the meantime, to tide you over, my fiction horror novella, One Hand to Hold, One Hand to Carve, is newly available from Tenebris Press.
Oh, bravo.
Great, thank you for that introduction. Alice, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Alice Toohey. I have to say, first of all, I am very excited about speculative cats and speculative trees. That sounds awesome. So I am, my name is Alice Toohey. My pronouns are she, her. I'm based out of the East San Francisco Bay Area, where it's just a little after 6 o'clock. I write poetry and fiction, and then I sometimes try to find ways to, like, you know, sneakily shove a little bit of poetry into my fiction. So yeah, I have a lot of fun with that, particularly with Flash. I'm not actually on Twitter or Instagram, but I did recently create a website, alicetoohey.com, where you can find links to my writing as well as pictures of my cats, which is, I think, what everybody's really interested in.
Yes, always here for cats. And Wendy, we got you on camera. We're so excited. Tell us about yourself.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Sarah. My name is Wendy Van Camp. I'm a poet, I'm an illustrator, I'm an author, and a podcaster, and a lot of other hats that I wear. I'm also an editor these days. I am just about to launch Eccentric Orbits 3, which is my second annual anthology of speculative poetry. And it's very exciting. I have top names in the speculative poetry field in the book. Everyone's been very supportive, and I'm very excited for the project. Um, I am a Elgin nominee, Pushcart Prize nominee. I guess I've recently been nominated for some Dwarf Stars too, which is kind of fun. Dwarf Star is for micro speculative poetry, by the way, for those who don't know. And basically, I've been writing poetry for about 8 or 9 years. I've been a novelist for about 10 to 12 years, and I just love the community. I love being a writer, love coming and doing panels and having wonderful discussions. I'm certainly looking forward to this one.
Thank you all so much. So we're not the only panel on speculative poetry that will be taking place this weekend. Who is on all of them? But we are the first, I think. So let's very quickly define our terms. And I know there's some curiosity from the Discord chat as well. So I'd like to ask you, what is speculative poetry, or what does that mean to you? And let's go in the same order, starting with Akua.
Okay, I said I have an elevator speech. I will
Yes.
cite it. Speculative poetry is the poetry of possibilities, presenting the unreal as if it's real. It's defined by its subject matter because it takes all forms. And those subjects include Afrofuturism, alternate history, astropoetry, cryptids, cyberpunk, dystopian, ecofuturism, fabulism, fairy tales, fantasy, folklore, hope punk, horror, magic, monsters, mythology, occult, paranormal, robot, science fiction, shifters, slipstream, solar punk, solar funk, space opera, steampunk, superhero, supernatural, sword and sorcery, sword and soul, time travel, post-apocalyptic, and weird. And again, it takes all forms, including one of its own called sci-fi.
It sounds like I should have asked, what isn't speculative poetry? But I love that great, like rich start to this question. M. Shaw, what would you say?
My answer is probably much more boring and predicated on my experience in the slam scene. And I would say that like speculative poetry is mostly a question of marketing, as with genre in general. The poem that I took to the National Poetry Slam a few years ago is called "Don't Put My Death on Facebook," and it's about wanting to be tormented by the ghost of your dead lover because feeling pain is better than feeling nothing. And it's like, I don't think a lot of people would consider that speculative, depending on the venue. If I'm performing it at a slam, that's one thing. If it's appearing in a horror poetry anthology, that's something else completely. I'm trying to remember if it was Theodore Sturgeon that said this about speculative fiction, that it's what I point to when I say it, which is maybe a little uh, um, it's maybe a little hand wavy for my taste, but it's definitely on the right track. I think it's mostly about who your audience is and how you're presenting yourself and what you and they are hoping to get out of the experience.
Well, it's always good to have more possibilities rather than fewer, for certain. Alice, what would you say speculative poetry is?
I mean, yes to what Akua and Emma both said. It's interesting, when I first heard the question, my initial thought was, well, all poetry is speculative, which I know is maybe a little bit silly, but I guess for me, it just gets to the fact that I think of poetry very much as being more comfortable being in sort of a liminal space, or being a little bit part of the world, but removed from the world. And so I guess for me, speculative poetry is just poetry that's willing to, kind of take that additional step away from the known world. But I do agree that I think it probably is somewhat just a matter of marketing and venue.
Great, thank you. Wendy, how about you?
Well, I view it as I do the science fiction, speculative genre in general. It's just in poetic form. Um, it's a place where we explore the future and we allow our readers and listeners to explore it with us, to learn of new possibilities of what may happen, good, bad, and different, and let them make their own choices and to educate them about that. And for me, that's what speculative poetry is all about.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So I know that as writers, you all explore lots of different genres, both in prose as well as poetry. But I'd like to start talking about a really specific form of poetry that I know a few of you have experience with. And let's start with Wendy. Wendy, the first thing I learned about you is a new to me term, which is that you write sci-fi coup. What is that?
Well, it's kind of the poetry I'm most known for. I've certainly written a lot of it, and I've even have a entire book volume of sci-fi coup poems that was nominated for the Elegant twice. But basically, it's traditional haiku, except with a science fiction theme. Sci-fi coup basically means science fiction haiku. Now, English language haiku, we take a few more liberties with. We are not stuck in the 3, 7, 5 syllable structure of Japanese haiku. In the English language, we are allowed to have a few extra syllables or fewer syllables. It's more fluid. But the important thing is to write the poem so it's a moment in time and that it's an expression of an emotion, an expression of a place, and to burrow down to that really tiny moment and make the expression of the poem. And for me, writing sci-fi coup, um, haiku has a term called a kigo, which is a seasonal word. And even though I try to work seasonal words in, or my interpretation of that is to use an explanation of time as my seasonal word, because in space nobody can hear the snowfall, right? Or whatever. So that's what I do, but a kigo is not required in sci-fi coup as it is in haiku. So as you can see, there are some differences. They are a little open to interpretation by each various poet. And I do want to say that sci-fi coup is not something I invented. I know it's associated with me a lot, but it's actually been around for about maybe 40, 50 years. Some famous sci-fi authors that have written it are people like David Brin, and there's like it was a Hal Sheckley, I believe. There's a couple of them out there. They used to use them as like chapter heads. David Brin went as an extra step, and he used it as the dolphin language called Trinity. And his dolphins, his uplifted dolphins, as you would, speak in sci-fi coup, basically. So it's been out there a long time. It's an established form. And anyone that'd like to try it, I really encourage you to do it, because if you can write really tiny poems, you can do anything.
So I have a follow-up question for you that I will also be asking of Akua, because I believe you also have written sci-fi coup in the past. But so what are the benefits or the challenges of trying to compress a speculative image or story into that small of a space, the itty-bitty poem?
Well, one of the reasons I started writing sci-fi coup is because I was a science fiction author. And I took a course at the University of Iowa, which has that really famous writing program. And this particular class was writing haiku to establish your world. Because if you can write small poems about various places in the world you are developing, and he was saying haiku, not sci-fi coup, because he was a literary writer, but he says this is a great way for you as a writer to really immerse yourself in the world. And so what I started doing was writing sci-fi coup or haiku poems about the planets of the solar system, because I have several writing projects that are set here. I have one set on Venus. I have another one set on Mars. I'm still working on them, of course. They're not out yet, but writing the sci-fi coup poetry ahead of time, and of course publishing it, has really grounded me in these settings in a way that really is unique. And it ties into your emotions of the place. It ties into the research to develop all the poetry, and then all that same research will apply later to my novels. So for me, that is a great reason to write haiku and sci-fi coup.
Thank you so much. Aku, what are your thoughts on this? You have such a volume of a body of poetic work, and I'm curious how writing the haiku is different for you from these other styles of poems you've written.
For me, it's the most difficult because I begin large, not small, and there's a for me, it's a nearly spiritual practice when I'm trying to write haiku or even sci-fi coup. Wendy touches on a piece of it, the depth of learning by reducing the volume of information into 3 lines. So you're distilling, you're examining, you're learning about yourself, you're living so deeply in that moment. Words are our friends, and there are many, many of them. But what are those few that will evoke and involve all the senses and give someone the experience? I find it's my challenge, but it's also my practice. You can be short and still not hit the mark. The most magnificent haiku, though, is unfolds. It's an ever unfold. So okay, so it's back to, you know, how do I condense, distill, experience in a way that's concrete and compelling?
I love that idea of a haiku unfolding, and I think there's a resonance, maybe a strange one, with what Wendy was saying about thinking about time in a different way with a spec fic poem. Thank you both. Now, this question is really for anyone on the panel because I know that you all write fiction as well as poetry, but I'd like to start with Shaw and Alice. So because you're both prose writers and poetry writers, when is poetry the right medium for your message? Like when do you find poetry to be the right container, if that makes sense, for a speculative story?
It really depends on how weird I want to be, first and foremost. My poetry tends to be a lot more kind of like direct and cerebral than any of the narrative work I do. Also, the best example I can give is like I just pulled this notebook out of my hand and it's like an outline of a short story or a novella or something of that nature. It looks like you more or less expect an outline to look. A draft or an outline of a poem looks more like this. That starts with a long scream and has a lot of words in all caps, and it's kind of something I do when I'm trying to be a lot more um, confrontational about stuff. That said, the longer I work, the more the line blurs for me between what I even consider a poetic work of mine and what I consider a fiction work. I'm working on a guide to the Jewish afterlife in the form of a bird identification guide, and it's like, is that fiction? Is that poetry? I don't know. It's weird. Probably poetry. Let's see how it goes.
I think that probably resonates with some folks in the chat who I'm seeing a lot of people saying, I don't really think of myself as a poet, but then I tried it. So hopefully that will be inspiration. Alice, how about you?
And that project sounds amazing. Just want to say that. I think for me, that's why I sometimes, and to what Em said, I mean, in terms of the lines being blurred, I do find that a lot of times I write flash fiction because you can sort of make flash fiction that has some elements of both, right? It can be kind of almost like an extended prose poem that still has some elements of fiction to it. I recently recently ran across this term negative capability. I think it was John Keats introduced it, and it was this idea that he had that like a poet or an artist should be able to sort of stand in sort of beauty or truth or like a mystery and not have to sort of over explain it or kind of resort to a lot of logic to explain it. And I've been thinking about that a lot because I think for me that's when I tend to lean towards poetry. Is I feel like poetry, or at least for me, I'm more comfortable in poetry letting things be ambiguous or just letting a moment just be what it is, as opposed to fiction where, I tend to feel more of a, like I have to worry about things like, plot and character development and that kind of thing. I feel like poetry allows me to just kind of hone in on a moment and just kind of like be in that moment a little bit more. But like I said, I also oftentimes find that like I'll just sort of have this concept and it'll just sort of evolve into something that's flash that really does have a lot of elements of poetry to it as well.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that?
It's just curious to me that the best fiction is often described as being poetic.
Mm-hmm.
So I concur about the blurred lines, but fiction has duties and is freighted with other obligations that poetry is not.
Yeah. I like to use poetry for certain ideas and go into prose in others. And it's really more of the complexity of the scene. If there's too many moving elements, it becomes prose. But if it's really about an idea of an emotional state or a simple idea, something that can be distilled down, then it becomes a poem. I do know lately I have been turning to some of my prose pieces and looking at them with a new eye of how they can become poetry and not just sci-fi coup, which I'm known for, but longer form poems. And it's been an interesting experience for me. I think there'll be more of that coming out from me in the future.
These last few responses just segue so nicely to a direction that I was hoping we would go in, which is, when we talk about craft, I think we're talking about how does the work get done? Like how does the work get on the page? And it sounds like Wendy, you're kind of thinking about a process of revision where you take your story from one form and you translate it into another form. What do you find changing when you practice that?
It's kind of a matter of my muse takes over. It kind of rattles my shoulders and said, "You must listen to me and do this." And it's sometimes it's just a matter of intuition. I find my poetry is more inspired by intuition. I will often sit with my notebook and fountain pen. That's how I compose my poetry. I find I do not do well doing poetry on a computer screen. I do great with prose, because the words just type out and they flow out that way. But when it comes to poetry, I need to get away from all that. I might use a computer screen for research, have it in front of me or have it on my phone on the desk. But when it comes to the actual composition, I like to just write things out slowly by hand because I never know what part of what I'm writing is going to be the useful part. And I start out with just reading whatever the original text is. It could be a scientific article that I want to base a poem on, because a lot of my sci-fi coup comes from there. It could be a previous bit of prose, or sometimes I'm out walking and I have my microphone up to my mouth and I'm just talking about something that interests me that I might want to write about later. And then I transcribe that and then I look at that. And from there, I start doing the pooling of phrases. I'm a poet that likes to do phrases first, just random ideas written down in chunks of phrases. And then I take those phrases and I distill them down again into the actual poetry. So for me, it's really a very intuitive process with pen and ink. Maybe that's old fashioned of me. I'm showing my age, but that's how I seem to roll with it.
I just want to interject briefly to say I glanced at the chat and some folks are saying, well, I can't write poetry on a screen either. So you have some kinfolk in the audience as well, and also some folks who started writing in prose and found that they were actually writing a poem. So I knew that would resonate with people listening in. I'd love to ask other members of the panel about your writing process. Anything you'd like to share about it, whether it's how you generate ideas for your work or just like the nitty gritty, whether you write in pencil or on screen. What can you tell us?
I use everything.
Mm-hmm.
So since I also like visual art, I found that moving from a pen to a gel pen was wonderful. I use notepads, I use notebooks. I I also I'm not computer averse, but I found it burdensome but necessary for longer things. And I wanted to share with people who may be um, not pen and paper oriented nor computer oriented. There's another option, and my joy in life is to proselytize about speech to text, which has liberated me, which has increased my productivity so fabulously and enormously. It turns out if you're on the Mac system, on the Apple systems, um, almost everything or anything that's a word processing program, all you have to do is talk. But before I was told that, I didn't know that. But what I said through when I found it mid last year is there's a thing called Speech Texter, which is free and available on Google, and it's speech to text. So if you've got any issues or fatigue or hand-eye things, there's another way for you to write. So I just wanted to make sure I mention that and proselytize about that, because for all the things I use, uh, I the energy, the mind is there, but the body isn't always willing, and so there's still a way to write.
I definitely want to hear from Shaw and Alice on this topic, but Akua, from the Discord chat, we had Jane Dreamforge asked, do you do visual poems too, where you combine visual arts with your poems? And I
Absolutely.
can
Yeah.
concur. That's the form I found your sci-fi coup in.
And Wendy too.
Yeah,
So
I illustrate my poetry, and that's actually how my poetry was first discovered. I just happened to be taking poems that I had published in a small magazine called Far Horizons, which is no longer out there, unfortunately. But I would take my published poems and I wanted to put them on my blog. And since I love to sketch, it's kind of my hobby, I would just do simple line art of my sci-fi coup poems and put them up as a simple blog post. Well, little did I know, people loved them. And before I knew it, a magazine that I am connected with in Los Angeles area called Quantum Visions, the editor needed illustrations. And I said, well, look at my blog. Would you like to use these? And I kind of was embarrassed, to be honest, because I look at them and to me they seem very simple compared to what a lot of other artists do. But she loved them. And as it turns out, their very simplicity, which actually is the essence of sci-fi coup at its heart, made them really excellent for illustrations in magazines. And they're black and white, they're cheaper to print, that kind of thing. And so I ended up doing those for about 8 years before her magazine finally retired. And now I sell them as art prints up on Etsy and at various science fiction conventions all over America, or at least I did before the current situation. But I'll be back doing that soon too. I think I'm going to be back at Comic Con this year, and I'll have them back up on the pegboards. What can I say?
Thank you so much. Let's go to Alice and Shaw for questions about process. And then I see we're getting a couple more questions in the chat. I will turn to those shortly. And thank you all so much. Please feel free to add any other questions you want to ask the panelists into the WebEx chat. Alice, let's start with you.
Process, yeah. I wish I had one. No, I think for me, with poetry, it'll usually start, like I said, with a moment or an idea or an image, oftentimes inspired by nature. I do write a lot about the natural world and about sort of climate change. Usually I'll have some kind of a first draft, and then I usually have to just kind of leave it for a while and then come back to it later and see what it's trying to tell me. Because, invariably for me with poetry, it usually takes actually just getting some words on paper and then stepping away before I kind of realize who this poem is trying to be. And then the process of revision is just trying to kind of, change it, make the poem then align with that vision. I do, like I think Wendy said, a lot of times, when you get a first draft down, you go back later and you'll be like, wow, these are the lines that I really like, the phrases that I really want to keep. And then sometimes it's also a matter of, for me, going back and trying to sort of add specificity, and trying to, kind of hone in on what it is I'm trying to say with that poem. And I mentioned I do a lot of flash fiction. So it's, I think, a similar process. I think with flash, the thing that's sort of challenging and fun about doing flash for me from that perspective is, trying to get that same sort of rhythm and beauty of the language while also having to worry about, is there a plot? Are there characters? And so it's for me, when I work on flash, it's always a real balancing act between those two things. But it's really exciting when you read flash poetry that kind of brings those elements together.
Great, thank you. Shaw?
My method is pretty much I walk in circles and talk to myself. It's almost a step beyond speech to text. I guess really speech to text is what I'm using when it comes right down to it. But it's one of the many reasons why it's good that I also work as a nighttime security guard at an art museum, because there is plenty of space for me to walk in circles and recite the poems that I have not yet written down aloud without annoying my cats or anyone. There was this incident a few years ago where I came home after a slam night and composed a new piece, and the next morning I told my my now ex spouse that I had written a new poem after I came home last night, and she was like, "Yeah, I know, I heard you the whole time," which I got so into it that it hadn't even occurred to me. I mean, I had the whole poem written before I wrote a thing, but for whatever reason, that's just what works for me when I'm not scribbling gibberish in a notebook like I showed just before.
Now I'm wanting footnotes about which poems were written in which galleries of the art museum. I think that would be really interesting. Speaking of speech to text, we did have a question from the chat, I think maybe directed to Akua, but it seems like several of you also use this technology. We're getting really technical, I love it. When you use speech to text, do you find it difficult to include the punctuation as you speak?
No. If you read, I was trying to think of how to put it, like a learning curve. I can say new paragraph, I can say period, I can say, what else do you want? Oh, comma. If you go there, there's a list of all the things you can tell it to do while you're doing it. I prefer not to, though, however, because what's wonderful is getting the words down. The edit is another part of writing process. So I try not to edit as I'm talking, more to get the thoughts out. It's really interesting to me. I've tried it both ways, and I love not seeing the line breaks. That's something interesting, different that the speech to text does that even my writing doesn't do, because I don't know. I mean, because over time when I'm writing, I am doing these units, and the speech to text recombines those units. And so editing that furthers the creation of the poem.
I think that as resonates really nicely with what we were talking about earlier in terms of shifting something from one form to another. What an interesting phase of the writing process to have it
Yes.
in the telegraph phase and then the revision phase. Does anyone want to add to that?
I would. You don't necessarily have to do that anymore. Many of the programs punctuate now. I use a app called Otter, which I believe is on all platforms, and it punctuates for me. Although I like Akua's method too, because then you get these unusual conjunctions that you maybe did not attend to do. But, you know, in a pinch and you need things to be punctuated, use Otter. I believe Google Docs also does it automatically too. So many of these AI systems are kind of catching up with things. And you may not need to put in the verbal punctuation. But again, like anything, it's just practice. And I do it either way. So.
So as we wind down to our last few minutes of the panel, and before my final lightning round question that I have for you, I definitely want to talk about editorship. So I know several of you are in the position to be readers for awards or editors for anthologies. So you're not just writing poetry, you're also assessing it. You're also thinking about what to publish. And I would love to hear from you. And let's start with Akua for this one. About any patterns that you've noticed about what works well in speculative poetry or what doesn't work or what you would like to see.
I made a list of do's and don'ts for you.
Mhm.
Since I was forewarned, I wanted to be forearmed. Um, the I should almost never be you. Don't break the fourth wall. Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't excuse. No ifs, no buts. Research your claims. I'll give you a quick example of that. A poem had two suns rising on Triton. Triton is the largest of Neptune's 13 moons. So where the heck was this? Research what you're saying. Inhabit your moment as fully as possible. Don't desert it. Don't break the spell. Stay where you are. Stay in the moment. Be in the present. Whether that present is in the past or the future, stay there. Look around where you are. Use your senses or their correlates or their extension. And immersive beats TV viewing. So that's my quick list of speculative poetry do's and don'ts.
Your list would make a good visual poem on its own. No ifs, no buts, no apologies. I love hearing it. Wendy, what would you add?
For me, it's more of a gut kind of thing when I read through things. I look for poems that will be easier to format in my book, to be perfectly blunt. I look for spelling. I look for quality of ideas, and I look for I don't know. I guess it is kind of an instinctual thing for me. But I tend to, for some reason, I attract really good poets. I don't know why, but they seem to find me. And I haven't had a lot of the problems that Akua has spoken of. I know we have spoken in the past about some of the slush pile that she gets and the slush pile I get, and it's like
We
night and
have.
day. I just I'm grateful blessed that I don't have to deal with a lot of that. Most of the poetry that comes to me is very readable, with a few exceptions, of course. Um, but yeah, just clarity of idea, the same kind of principles that you would apply to your prose, apply it to poetry, and that'll get you there.
Thank you so much. Shaw, you operate a small press. What's your perspective on this?
I do. I operate a small press called Trouble Department, which publishes about 70% poetry. Most relevant to this panel, it hasn't been announced yet, but we did just acquire a book of poems by Jerry Lean, whose work you may see around in
Yes.
like Strange Horizons,
Anthology.
Yeah.
Starline, Dreams and Nightmares, places like that. When it comes to what really strikes a chord with me in terms of submissions, which are for folks asking, we open to submissions every September. I really enjoy seeing stuff that has a sense of play to it. Just understand that when I say play, I'm thinking less board game and more wolves wrestling in the mud, like playing with your teeth out, kind of deal. I really appreciate work and writers who embrace the idea, especially with poetry, that like you can just do shit. You can just do whatever you want. It's all a really free sort of experimental make believe space. That the name of the press again is Trouble Department. So troubledepartment.com is the website. Pretty easy to find, hopefully. But yeah, we a lot of our poetry books are weird kids too. The one that's coming out later this month, Body Electronic by Eric Francis. I keep telling people it's kind of like the Janelle Monáe album Dirty Computer, but with more poop jokes. So like between that and like if you've read Jerry's work or if you've read any of the other Trouble Department books, I think that probably gives a pretty thorough idea.
That's so great, thank you. Akua, we're getting requests in the chat for your list of do's and don'ts. If you can make that available in the Discord later, I think folks
I
be
will.
grateful. So lightning round, we do have a lot of people in the chat who seem to be, let's call them emerging speculative poets. Maybe they haven't thought of themselves as poets before. They're dipping a toe in those waters. Let's go around quickly and just have a word of advice for folks who are just starting out in this really exciting field. Let's start with Akua.
Do it, please. I welcome more. There's plenty of room. I want everybody to write, and I believe everybody has a poem in them. And the only thing that stops them is themselves. Don't stop.
Wonderful. Shaw?
Well, my granddad was a music teacher, and a piece of advice he would often give is if you're going to make a mistake, make a loud one. And I think that really resonates with poetry too. Sort of like turn off that censor. Don't be afraid to misstep or afraid to fail. Just go all in and get what you're going to get.
Awesome. Alice?
Two things. I think the first thing I'd say is for poetry, especially, lean into what you love. I mean, if there are things about language, about writing that draw you, really lean into those. And then the other thing I would recommend is, I think it's on just a little more like nuts and bolts. I think it's on Coursera. There's an amazing poet, Douglas Kearney, who did like a free course on Coursera. It's wonderful. He's a fantastic lecturer, and he does get a little more kind of nuts and bolts on like, sentence breaks and like, stanzas and sounds. So if you're kind of wanting just a little bit of a primer of like what is poetry or some of the kind of tools of poetry, that's a great place to start. So I just want to throw that out there.
Super helpful. And Wendy, close us out.
Well, I think my biggest tool is to listen. Go to open mics. Sit in the back if you must. Sit up front, be brave, and read your work. Don't worry, it's just you and the chickens,
They love it when you sit up front.
Yes.
We have a lot of friends that way.
But also go and listen to poets that maybe you admire or ones that you've heard about that are really good. I always recommend going to listen to poet laureates, even though they're not speculative. Chances are their poetry is excellent and worth listening to. And there's a lot of speculative poetry at the various conventions that have been popping up. It's been a lot more open mics lately for speculative poetry. There are more panels to go listen to. So just frequent them and listen, and you will learn a lot.
Thank you all so much. This has been fantastic. I feel like I have learned a lot, and I've enjoyed hearing from you so much. Panelists, please, when you get a chance, check out the Discord chat because we had some really lively and just warm conversation going on there. Folks in the chat, definitely find these poets online, seek them out, read their work, and enjoy the rest of your flights. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.